Hello and good afternoon to this, our third session of Series 2 of the Éimear Book Club. I want to send out a warm welcome to all of you who are joining us again as part of the series, and for all the new participants who've decided to join us this afternoon. It's from a wet and blustery Éimear Abbey that I greet you this afternoon with storms. A storm Ellen, I believe, is on its way. My name is Lisa Caulfield, and I'm the director of the Notre Dame Center here at Éimear Abbey. And we are graciously welcoming Dr. Éimear O'Connor today as a panelist and Declan Kyberd as our professor of note. Just to update you on the numbers for today, we are up to 739 participants who have registered in this program. So people are still downloading the lectures. The lectures are up and online and will continue to be so from the first series as well as the series that we have started this August. At this time, I just want to quickly thank, as always, the sponsors of the Éimear Book Club, without whom we could not have done this. And the great news is that we'll be recreating other book clubs for around the world, which is fantastic. So just to thank the Notre Dame International, who will be sponsoring other book clubs from other locations, the Keough Naughton Institute for Irish Studies, the College of Arts and Letters, the Keough School of Global Affairs, Notre Dame Learning, of course, all of which wouldn't have been possible for this online, sophisticated way of meeting with everybody, and of course, the Notre Dame Alumni Association. So the format today, as always, Declan will give a recap of his lectures, and then we'll ask Éimear to come and discuss. We will have a 10-minute breakout session, as we always do, for you to participate. And Declan has kindly provided us some questions for you to peruse in your group, in your breakout session. So I'd like you to just keep with one person who could possibly be the spokesperson for your group, and then they could submit the questions during the form. We're going to share the Google form that you can submit your questions on. We're sharing it right now in the chat function. Just remember to link into that so that we can get the questions in a timely manner, and that we'll get to them all within the hour is our hope. There's also the LinkedIn discussion board, which we've continued to monitor should you guys have more questions that you'd like to address with Professor Kyberd and Dr. Éimear O'Connor. We are happy to go back to that LinkedIn discussion board, which I hope that you can join as well. So this week, I have the great pleasure of welcoming Éimear O'Connor, who is an art historian, curator, lecturer, and archivist, to join us to discuss the body in Irish literature. Éimear has been a keynote speaker for our International Art Residency program here at Éimear last summer, and Éimear curated a retrospective of local artist Margaret Irwin West, whom she introduced our students to. I would like to warmly welcome Éimear and Declan to give us an overview of this week's topic and start the discussion. Declan, please.
Thank you so much, Lisa. And I want to also thank Éimear O'Connor, Dr. Éimear O'Connor, for being with us. I have to say, I approach today's session a bit like an atheist at a Eucharistic Congress, because we're going to focus a lot on visual art, and this is an away game for me and a home game for Éimear. So I am increasingly going to turn the discussion over to her. But let me begin by reminding you all that we were talking about the split between body and mind in Irish culture. It's a split, of course, that goes as far back as Plato, nothing particularly Irish about it. But in 19th century Ireland, it's often been held that the influence of Jansenism from the new seminary at Maynooth increased the distrust of the human body. I think it's interesting, in fact, that the presbytery in some ways began to replace the big house, and priests, who were often called young dandies, replaced the aristocrats. The aristocrats used to have the droit de seigneur, which was including the right, alleged right, to abuse children, poor children. And I often have thought in recent controversies about the abuse of children by clergy that maybe this goes back to that big house tradition. Even more important, of course, in the 19th century is the increasing size of families. Priests came from those families, and they knew that if those families got bigger and bigger and bigger, the family farm would be less economically viable. So there was a practical reason why priests also preached often against sexuality. But of course, Nuala Ní Dhomhnaill, in some of her wonderful poems and essays, has shown us that this, if you like, split between body and mind is a much more ancient vintage in Ireland. She thinks, I think, that the Irish language was a language of feeling, and that English in its early days, especially here, was very much the language of thought, but that the dispute between the two set up a dispute between emotion and intellect, which I think we find in a lot of post-colonial societies. If you go further back still, though, Nuala Ní Dhomhnaill says, and think of all the warrior beheadings that are part of our ancient mythology. This is a literal bisecting of the head from the body, as if to enact the absolute separation of the two. And maybe there the aggression is more towards the head than towards the body, but it's still very much against the whole idea of them being conjoined. Now, I asked everyone to look at Crazy Jane and the Bishop, Yeats's famous poem, and I suggested that it might be linked to the Hag of Bear poem, which is one of the most famous Old Irish lyrics. That lyric is normally seen as spoken by a male, but about the hag, the old woman who has had a lusty life in spring, summer, and autumn, and is about to retire to a monastery in old age and looks back on the life. But it's as if the poet is using that metaphor to describe his allegiance to many different patrons before in the end he had to reconcile with Mother Church. It's interesting to me that so many Irish writers like Yeats, when they reach middle age, write in the female voice. You have Joyce's Molly, Beckett's Winnie, Catriona Fodine in Martin O'Kine. It's as if when they achieve a level of success and self-confidence and relaxation, they are suddenly able in a macho culture for the first time to give voice to the woman within. And yet when that woman emerges, she is often surly, even as Yeats said, sluttish and slatternly, perhaps because of all the decades of repression. And the other thing is that once that female presence is admitted in a male, she cries out for proof that the man, despite this admission, is still reassuringly masculine. I used to think of this when I watched the Beatles and the Rolling Stones back in the 60s, the way in which they wore their hair long and in one way expressed what might be called a feminine dimension, especially when they sang high falsetto notes. And I remember my mother and father coming into the room during Top of the Pops and asking about this. And my mother said, oh, these men are daring to be feminine. It's audacious. It's a kind of macho femininity. And my father, of course, being very critical of the whole thing. And of course, the misogynistic behavior of most of these rock stars proved that the woman in them was still crying out for proof that they were, in some almost distressing sense, reassuringly male. So it's an interesting set of issues that is raised. One other one I raised was Yeats's fascination with the famous Cherry Tree Carol, which you may have heard in Joan Baez's beautiful rendition. And it's about Joseph being a bit annoyed and saying, if the Virgin Mary wants cherries, let them give you cherries who got you with child. And then up speaks the little child in his mother's womb and says, lay down, you sweet cherry tree, and give my mother some. And Yeats was interested in the fact that Christian brothers said this was a horrible insult to God. And Yeats thought more and more about it, about the beautiful carol. And he said, no, the problem is the Christian brothers don't believe in the incarnation, God in the messiness of human form. They think they believe in it, but they don't. And the song fills them with fear. So these were just some of my thoughts as I looked at this phase in Yeats's writing. And I know that Éimear has so many ideas about this. Perhaps I should turn it over to her now.
Thanks very much, Declan. It's always fascinating listening to I want to pick up where you just left off with the idea of the cherry tree song, and we could maybe just look at the first painting of Declan's, please. That would be great, yeah. So I just want to get to this idea of the notion that artists very often used their mistresses as models in paintings. What's interesting about this one is they're ordinary people dressed in reasonably ordinary clothes. But in art history, an artist model was usually considered degenerate, and you'll hear me use that word a lot. In other words, if you were to think in opposites, she would be the slut as opposed to the sacred. And they used to think it funny to dress their models in this way, their degenerate models, in the nice posh clothes of the upper classes. It's a sort of a joke in a way. It's a sort of a joke, and yet, you know, it isn't funny at all. The interesting thing about these paintings, and let's just put up the next one. There's a number of these paintings. The next one is by Giulio Romano, very well known, by the way, for his use of that unusual shade of pink. The unusual thing about the pregnant Mary in art is that you really do not see it in Irish art. So we're going to move through these a little quicker. We just go through the other ones. This one is Roger van der Weyden. This was a very accepted trope in Renaissance art and would still be a very accepted trope. It was an accepted trope through European modernism, for those of you who are interested in modernism, but absolutely not in Irish art. And more specifically because the Catholic Church was absolutely in charge. This one is La Francini. They're beautiful paintings. An unknown master. That's the last one. We won't move on just for a moment because I think that's the last one of Declan's, isn't it?
Could I ask you though, Éimear, about that? I mean, you're saying in one way these were degenerate women who also were asked to pose as the Blessed Virgin Mary. Yeah. In the poem of Yeats, Jane says, "Fair and foul are next of kin, and fair needs foul," I cried. Yeah. That some kind of link suggested between the sacred and the profane.
Absolutely. I agree with you completely, Declan. And I think what Yates was doing was usurping what the Catholic Church was trying to do in Ireland, where there was immediately a reaction to women's sexuality. And so there's all kinds of stories doing the rounds of Irish art historians of people who were commissioned to do work for the Church of the Virgin Mary, and anybody that showed up with the Virgin Mary pregnant. Sean Keating certainly did in a mural in the 1940s in Dublin, and I just heard of another stained glass artist who did up in Donegal. They were told to take the pregnancy off the Virgin Mary, just take it off. We're just not having that, you know. So there was this idea that perfection was marriage to a husband, by the way, not gay marriage, but it had to be a man and a woman, and 2.2 children, and preferably not 22, even though contraception wasn't allowed. Which brings me to the whole other issue that we'll talk about later. But one of the points that you raised in your very excellent presentations, Declan, was that it was really from the point of the famine that Irish people began to lose their faith in nature. That's what you said, I think. And I have a painting by a woman. Can we put that one up, please? By Lady Elizabeth Butler. And it's the next one. That's it. Now, this is a very interesting painting. It's by a woman called Lady Elizabeth Butler, and it's called The Eviction, painted in the 1880s. And I find it an extraordinary image because it is showing the lesser, the working class woman, but she is in this liminal space that is not slut and is not, but she's very nearly sacred if you look at the way she's posed. Now, it's quite dramatic. The soldiers in the background have come up and they've taken the roof off the house and they've bashed the house down, and she's sort of dramatically posed as if to say, well, what am I going to do? My life is ruined. This is the only kind of, it's that liminal depiction of the woman I was interested in terms of what you were talking about, because when we move on through the history of the foundation of the state, things change entirely. And I went looking, for instance, for an image of a pregnant woman, and we just put up the next image, if we may. Now, this image had been sitting in the Abbey Theatre since 1913. It is of Molly Allgood, painted by John Butler Yeats, the father of William Butler Yeats, who disappeared off to America, by the way, in 1907 and never went home again. His daughters never saw him again. But this is Molly Allgood, who was the fiancée of John Millington Synge. And of course, when John Millington Synge died, Molly Allgood was incredible. They'd never married before he died. She was incredibly upset and went on to marry, I forget the man's name, but she was married. Now, this painting had been sitting in the Abbey Theatre since 1913, and my brother brought out a book about John Millington Synge, and I was asked to do a talk. And I said to them, well, do you not realise that Molly Allgood is pregnant? She's holding her tummy in the way that pregnant women do. Now, it's not, you're not looking at the full picture there. We couldn't get the full picture to show you. It's a 3/4 length. She's pregnant, and of course, if you do your history, you do your contextual history, very important. She had her first son in 1913. So this is a very rare depiction of a pregnant woman in Irish art. What happens then is the Catholic Church kind of take control. People are looking, artists are looking for commissions. They go to the Catholic Church for commissions because, as you say, they take over from the big house. But because the Catholic Church are commissioning, there is no pregnant Virgin Mary. And this whole idea of the saint or the slut becomes even more embedded in the psyche of the way we are thinking in Ireland. So we just put up the next image, if we may, which is of a Magdalene Laundry. Now, in fact, we'll do the next one. We'll just leave this one and we'll go to the next one. Now, I found this image really interesting, Magdalene Laundry with the Virgin Mary. Now, that's the saint and the slut right there in front of you. So what happened was a woman got married, she had a child, that was fine. But if a woman had a child out of wedlock, or, and it very often happened, a woman's husband walked out and left her with children, she would end up degenerate and put in one of these Magdalene laundries, which were all over the country, and made to work washing the linen of the people who were the sacred or the others, and very often the Catholic Church too. And women spent their lives in these institutions with the unpregnant Virgin Mary staring at them. So it's an interesting kind of analogy with several of the themes you've been talking about, Declan, I think.
Yes, I mean, I feel that the distrust of nature, which I mentioned, which morphed into a distrust of sexuality, happened because the people had trusted nature. They trusted the potato, and it let them down. And ever afterwards, they couldn't look at the landscape or any of the beauties of the natural world without a shudder, if you like.
Yeah.
It isn't just sexuality, though it mainly may be that. It's everything. Yeah. And in my tracing of it, I suppose I would say that happened around the time of the famine, as we both agree. In the 1890s, you have Douglas Hyde publishing Aron Gra Cuaige Connacht, the love songs of Connacht, which are mostly spoken by young women. In fact, often out of frustration and yearning. But they are love songs, and they are songs of, in some ways, a very, very embodied and strong-minded sexuality. So it seemed to me, and of course, Synge drew heavily on these, especially for the lines he wrote for Molly Allgood as Peggy and Mike, the lady you showed in the painting, who played Peggy and Mike in the Playboy of the Western World. It's as if the revival authors are trying to restore sexuality after all those decades of denial, but in restoring it, seeing it as part of nature, because of course the landscape itself gets revived in the art of Jack Yates and in the art of the poetry of his brother William. So I suppose some of those horrific images you've shown us from post-Free State times, the one thing they're undeniable, and it's terrible, and it has its roots in the history we've both agreed about. But the Irish revival of the 1890s onwards was some kind of attempt to challenge all that, even if it wasn't fully successful.
I would absolutely agree with you, and I would say it was successful. And again, the theatre was a space, wasn't it? And books are a space for things like that to emerge and to happen. They're a space kind of out of reality. I would often describe these spaces as liminal spaces where things can happen. And I think it was extremely successful, actually. I think Singh's work particularly was extremely successful. I think really what happens, and I hate bashing the Catholic Church, but what happened was a complete dependency. As people lost their trust in the landscape became depopulated owing to death, but owing to people actually moving away and up to towns and into factories and into service. An awful lot of women went into service and the land was abandoned. But people needed something, and people became even more reliant, I think. They used to be reliant on nearly pagan things, you know, wish trees and wishing wells and all those things. But you know, it began to emerge from about 1914, 1915 onwards, this whole idea of a kind of a fusion with the Catholic Church that became more or less absolute on the signing of the treaty, I would argue, and even more absolute after the after 1937 Constitution. So I absolutely take your point, and you're correct. And I think that theatre and literature is still used in that way and has often driven change that has happened subsequently in Ireland, particularly around issues to do with sexuality, gender, abortion, and all of those other issues.
A thing that strikes me is that Catholicism in the second half of the 19th century became obsessed with rule keeping and external deference to clerical power, etc., etc.
Yeah.
And I think that helps to explain those institutions you're talking about and the kind of power that was wielded in them.
Yeah.
But in one sense, that's about social relationship and maybe even the abuse of it, but it's about ethics in the end. There's a distinction made by E.R. Dodds between the religious and the ethical. And he says the religious is about our relation with God, with eternity, with fate. But the ethical is merely about our social relationships with one another. And what seems to me to have happened partly after the famine is that more divine, if you like, or spiritual dimension in Irish Catholicism was replaced by this merely social movement, which in ways took on the functions of a welfare, or you might even say an ill-fare state, because of the savagery with which it was conducted. Yeah. But it was definitely an attempt to deal with, if you like, the casualties of society as they were then perceived.
Yeah.
But
I agree with you, actually, Declan. I'm just thinking, I think, I was thinking about this today, actually, as I was coming up here. You know, the workhouse was a very important, I mean, they were awful places, but the famine workhouses, I began to think really that the idea for the Magdalen laundries, for instance, really grew out of the whole workhouse sort of idea. And I think maybe when when all this was established, it was all probably considered a very good thing. Unfortunately, it was down to personalities who were running them, maybe, but that's maybe another discussion, you know. But yeah, I agree with you.
We had a very interesting discussion last time about pre-famine Gaelic Ireland and the way in which people who were considered eccentric or even deviant would be called something like Dinna Ladia, a person with God, someone who was already further on the road back to God. Yes. And there was a place in the community for all these people, whether they were blind or whether they were eccentric. And I even made the joke that in those days, the eccentric was seen as someone with a deeper than average understanding of the normal. But it's as if after the famine, with the growth of the panopticon and social institutions, institutions of surveillance, etc., which is of course something that happens across Europe, not just in Ireland. But the power of the Catholic Church is filtered through these institutions, and in the process, the vision of fate, divinity, destiny is somehow lost.
Yeah. You're making me, I couldn't agree with you more, and I'm thinking now of Lucia Joyce, actually, and that wonderful poem that you put in about her, about the sweet dancer, which is about Lucia, isn't it?
I think it could be.
I think it's
about the way modernist women dancers were replaced. Yeah.
Well, of course, and Lucia ended up, I mean, you know, they said she was schizophrenic. I wouldn't be too sure. but she ended up not only incarcerated in the way that one might have been in a Magdalen laundry, but kept incarcerated for the rest of her life by her brother. Which is, so these institutions were really helped along sometimes by members of the family who, for whatever reason, might want to incarcerate somebody. Do you know? I don't know why.
And you would expect that a family as liberal as the Joyces would have produced liberal children. But
Yeah.
Giorgio Joyce, the son,
Yeah.
he only visited his sister once in all her years.
I know, isn't it?
Incarcerated in Northampton, and that was on his way home from a conference about his father's Ulysses in Dublin.
But
it's a really shocking attitude.
Isn't it back to this idea, Declan, that, you know, she didn't quite conform with the norm in the way that a woman pregnant outside marriage wouldn't conform with the norm, and therefore it's easier to hide her from the public and abdicate responsibility in any way for her?
Yes, I remember my mother telling me that a friend of hers who was pregnant outside of marriage, my mother was friendly with an order of nuns, and she brought her friend to the nuns hoping that they might be able to help in some way. And the nun said that she was a slut, the pregnant girl, and that my mother was for helping her.
Yeah.
And my mother was a very, very devout traditional Catholic.
Yeah, it's shocking, isn't it?
It is amazing, but it's as if some dreadful set of censors got, you know, introjected into the psyche of people. And I think it did happen after the famine. I don't think the liberalism of behavior in pre-famine Ireland was anything like that. And there was a place within the community for all kinds of people who, after the famine, were declared deviant and fit only for institutions.
I agree with you thoroughly. And I was thinking again about all of this, and when did it all turn? You know, when I grew up, I went to a convent school, and, you know, you got married and that's what you did, and there was nothing else. You were a secretary first, by the way. You didn't go to college. You were a secretary, and then you got married, and you had your 2.2 children. And I was thinking, when did it all turn? And I can put it to an evening on the Late Late Show with Gay Byrne interviewing Annie Mccarrick. Do you remember that interview?
I do.
To me, I felt Ireland changing at that point. And Ireland, we're going to go on to the next image now, because we're going back to Crazy Jane, if that's okay. We come on and leaps and bounds. I think it has taken a while, but we have managed to adapt and move and become actually very modern in our thinking. So I just wanted to show you 3 paintings. There's a gallery in Sligo that actually did a show based on the theme of Crazy Jane. And I thought it'd be very interesting just to have a quick look at some of these paintings. This is The Fall by Rachel Romero, where, of course, Christ is the woman. It's just interesting, isn't it, to see the figures usurped in that way. The figure of Christ is now female. The next one I find really interesting. The next one is by Conor Walton, Crazy Jane. Now, there was a time in Irish art where you would never have been able to even show a painting like this. I have countless stories that I can tell you from my research of priests going into exhibitions and insisting that a normal nude, if you know what I mean, a display nude that would have been a model, would be taken out of an exhibition, otherwise the exhibition would be closed, right up until the 1970s. So now in 2017, we have a man, Conor Walton, presenting Crazy Jane in this way, which I find very modern and very interesting, with the bishop in the background. And then my final image is by Bernie Masterson. I met the bishop on the road. This was also part of this exhibition in the gallery in Sligo. Now, I really like this image because Bernie Masterson is getting back to the idea of the Sheila na gig, and going right back to the idea of I think we think that Sheila na gigs were pre-pagan symbols of fertility. So she's going right back there in 2017 with the open vulva and all of that, and saying, like, we have a hold of it again now, you know. So they're my images, Declan. I don't know, what do you think?
Well, I was very struck by the middle image that the bishop was almost faded to the point of non-entity in the background, even though the crozier was just about visible to be wielded. The power seemed to have gone.
Well, I think it's true to say now that in Ireland, and I mean, it's not fair to kind of, you know, bash the Catholic Church either. People, the institutions did as institutions did. People are people, and time moves and things change, and that's okay. But what's happened is we've come out of it a very forward-thinking country. We have divorce, which is I remember the whole divorce referendum. My father was set up the divorce action group. I remember all of that. Very adversarial it was, but we have divorce now, and we have gay marriage, which is a wonderful thing. There was a time when that would never have happened in Ireland, the whole idea, and then the Eighth Amendment too. So we have really moved on, but I would mark that point, and the way that you would mark is what we're talking about in terms of the famine. I would mark that point at the Late Late Show is actually a very powerful show. And I remember myself and my friends talking about that interview and saying, how dare they treat that woman like that? That woman was pregnant, but there was something about that interview that made us feel awful for her because she was pregnant and being treated in the way she was from members of the audience, some of whom were religious people. So it was a good turning point. We've come a long way. It's good.
And that was, of course, a mass popularity television show which everyone watched. Yeah. I wanted to ask you, though, say the Crazy Jane Talks with the Bishop poem, which Yeats writes decades earlier, and which presumably he intends partly as a critique of the emerging censorship mentality in Free State Ireland. Sure. Do you think that that kind of a poem and that kind of writing, including maybe Joyce's Molly Bloom, do you think they contributed anything to the slow liberalization, or are they just something that was conducted within the very pure world of the arts?
No, I think that they did absolutely contribute to the slow liberalization. But of course, the world of the arts is a huge world. We can't live without the arts. It infiltrates everything, you know. So I think that all of these, the poetry, the theatre, that's what's so interesting about the arts. The arts, it's very powerful. It can, and I mean, and it's really how the Eighth Amendment was won, by the way, through the arts. And in many ways, there was wonderful art pieces made, you know. So I'm diverging a bit, but I actually think that the arts are fundamental to how society moves forward. And one picks up on the other, picks up on the other. It's a cyclical thing. So absolutely, very, very powerful influence.
It's interesting that Oliver Gogarty, when he stood in the first Irish Senate, said to his fellow senators, we wouldn't be standing here in an independent Irish Senate were it not for the poetry of W.B. Yeats. He paid a very handsome tribute to his colleague. And I've always felt that, there's a slow drip, drip, drip effect from what seem like rarefied works of art, but, you know, eventually percolate through.
Yeah, and that's to do with the education system as well, you know, that children get to know the poetry and get to understand it, and children get in to see the plays and the theatre, and very, very important. The history of our art and culture is as important as now our contemporary art and culture to our identity and the way we see ourselves and moving forward, but that's the same around the world.
And when Yeats says he has the last speaker, whoever it is, say in the poem, love has pitched his mansion in the place of excrement. Yeah. He is talking, of course, about the human body and what is most sacred about it also being most fundamental in terms of sexual activity. Yeah. But that line is also, I think, a reference to the stable in Bethlehem. Love has pitched his mansion in the place of excrement. Yes. That literally Jesus chose to be born after the incarnation in the straw, among the animals, a line elsewhere which Yeats calls the uncontrollable mystery on the bestial floor. Yeah. So there is this link between the sexual and the spiritual. Carl Jung used to say when people brought him problems about sex, they always turned out to be of a religious nature. And whenever they came with problems of religion, they turned out to be sexual. So I do think Yeats is onto something in this brief poem.
Well, Declan and Éimear, thank you so much for such a riveting conversation. I think we might give our participants, an opportunity to discuss this. So we're going to break out to our group sessions, and I just ask that you consider these 3 questions, or address one of them if you can, that Declan has prepared for your session, and they're just showing up on the screen right now. And if you could please work together, introduce yourselves, perhaps share your location. This has become part of the success of the book club, is that you get to meet other participants, even if it is for a short time. And we hope that you are able to submit your questions that are on the chat function now, and we'll get to them as fast as we can once we return. We're going to give you about 8 minutes and then give you a 2-minute warning when we're going to be returning. For those of you who do not want to join the group discussion, you do not have to stay. You can just opt out, and you'll be put into the main waiting room, and then we'll just come back to you in the 8 minutes. So for now,
and I only thought of those questions before this brilliant contribution by Éimear. So people will have all kinds of other questions, I'm sure, too. Feel quite free to disregard mine and ask her all kinds of ones about the issue she's raised.
Thank you, Declan. We'll move now to the groups. Hello and welcome back to the main session. And just so you all know, we have recorded the sessions, and we will be making these available on podcast. So do not fear if you feel like you've missed out on any session. I hope you enjoyed the breakout room. I want to reiterate the chat function and to submit your questions. We've got some wonderful questions already. So paying attention to time, I'm going to go straight into it with our first question from Catherine in Dublin. And it's to you, Éimear. Éimear, I like the idea of John B. Yates's portrait as subversive, but do you think that it was deemed acceptable to paint Molly Allgood in a pregnant state because her profession was considered lowly at the time, notably among Synge's family?
I think it was absolutely appropriate. But what I find very interesting is that nobody realised that it was a portrait of a pregnant woman until, what year was it? I think it was 2015. and it's been there since 1913. John Butler Yeats painted the portrait in a very particular way. So you just saw a little bit of it in the full thing. When you see it in scale, you mightn't recognise that she was pregnant necessarily. Although it's very obvious when you really see it. When I say it to people, they say, oh yeah, she's definitely pregnant. Of course it was perfectly all right to do that. It was just a rare thing to do. But
Molly worked as a shop assistant in Arnott's department store, and she was from a Catholic background, so she was the polar opposite of Synge, who was a Protestant gentleman. And Synge once had the great idea that they should write a play in which Molly wrote all the male parts and he wrote all the female ones. So there's another example of my androgyny.
Yeah, it's fantastic, isn't it? It's such a pity that he died and they never had a chance to marry. But another answer to the question might be that maybe it was all right to paint her pregnant because she was an actress. There are very few paintings of pregnant women. Now, there are sculptures of pregnant women. Rome Gillespie has quite a well-known one, and there are others. So it seems to happen in sculpture, but not so much in painting. Good question. Thank you.
I'm going to go with, from Mary in Chesterton. Later in the 20th century, particularly in the 60s and 70s, the US saw the proliferation of sexually explicit literature. Was this influenced by the Irish authors we are discussing, or due to a different set of circumstances? I'd say that's for you, Declan.
Well, it might be for Éimear. I think I think that Joyce's influence, especially through the Molly Bloom monologue, had a massively liberating effect, certainly on writing. And you can see this through the 50s, 60s, and 70s. It's like an example of what Yeats once said, the future is what artists already are. But to suggest that the sexual revolution in America wasn't ultimately sourced in America, I think would be a foolish thing for me to say. Perhaps Éimear has thoughts on that.
Not really, I have to say. No, I couldn't answer it with authority, I have to say. I'd be inclined to disagree with the sort of central thesis of the question, but that's just an intuitive thing.
My next question is from Kathy in Minneapolis. I'm very much enjoying the interpretations of the feminine in Joyce's and Yates's work as presented in this series. But I was always given to understand that often female characters stood in for Ireland herself, and that these poems were politically sentimental, not romantically sentimental. Should they be read to be both?
That's definitely you, Declan.
Well, the kind of female as a figure of Ireland goes back to Gaelic poetry, Roisin Dove, Dark Rosaleen, all that. You can even find it in early Yeats, in the play in which Maud Gonne featured, Kathleen Ní Houlihan, though of course we now know that was co-authored by Lady Gregory, and she was this woman who would be liberated when the Fourth Green Field became Irish again and young men were willing to die for her. I find in the texts we're discussing here a kind of conscious rebellion against all that symbolism, and a feeling that we need real women as opposed to these idealized women on a pedestal. My argument would be, for instance, about Yeats, that by putting Maud on a pedestal and worshipping her, he was denying a femininity he should have first of all confronted in himself. Yeah? And that this is the mistake of Amour Courtois always. In the same way, it works in reverse. Women have exalted warrior males, and in doing so, denied a kind of warrior element they might first of all have encountered in themselves. So what I think people like Yeats and Joyce are doing in these works of art from the 20s and 30s is very much throwing that thing into question of Ireland equals the woman.
My next question, we actually have two of these questions for you, Éimear. It was about the Anna Mccarrick interview that you referenced. If you can give us a little bit more information of who she was and what was the context of the interview on the Late Late.
The context was that what was the priest? Eamon Casey was the bishop at the time, and Eamon Casey fathered a child by this woman, and the whole thing broke on the Late Late Show. Eamon Casey wasn't there to support her; she was there on her own, and Gay Byrne interviewed her to talk about it. It was an upsetting interview, and in the audience were several members of the Catholic Church who were also left to kind of interview her, and it was like an interrogation. And I remember as a young woman looking at this thinking to myself, but he was the bishop, for heaven's sakes. He was the senior figure, A. And B, it takes two to dance or two to tango, as we say here in Dublin. And why was the bishop not sitting with her? Why was there no support? But the bishop had gone off somewhere. He'd gone off for therapy, I think. Am I right, Declan? I think he was sent off for therapy somewhere.
Well, I think he went to Latin America for a while.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not defending the hypocrisy behind that program, but Bishop Casey was a man who was interested genuinely in liberation theology. He had worked with the Irish immigrant community in London. This is why it was such a sadness, I suppose, when the story broke of his double dealing, if you like, and hypocrisy, because he was a man whom many people greatly revered and loved. And I suppose it can be also said, you know, at a time when so many clergy were exposed as abusing children, what he did in one way was, quote unquote, natural, even though the way in which it was presented was deplorable.
Yeah, the way it was presented was deplorable, and there was another one that came after it then, quite soon after it, the other priest who did some with his housekeeper. And you know, we know like these are human beings. I never had any issue with the sexuality of what was going on. What I had an issue about was the fact that it was she that was kind of set upon by people, and he wasn't there to defend her or defend himself for that matter. I think he did defend himself at a later stage. But for me as a young woman at the time, still young, but you know what I mean, it was a turning point for me and for my friends in the way we thought about the church coming out of convent education. It was a turning point because suddenly priests came down from up there and they were human. They could get women pregnant. I don't think we even knew this.
I have another question here before we call it off from Catherine. Declan, you locate the mistrust of nature and sexuality in post-famine Ireland. Do you think this has anything to do with the anxieties of a country of people who perhaps felt left behind or perhaps felt that they had endured and survived?
There's always a question of survivor guilt about post-famine Ireland. And, you know, ghosts are walking not just of those who died, but of those who, if you like, had to leave. And I think, yes, there is a kind of almost unconfessed guilt felt among those who remain. And people talk about the incredible silence. I mentioned in my talk how noisy, tactile, clubbable Ireland was pre-famine. And then Brendan Kennelly has this great line post-famine, the awful silence moping through the land. So there was almost too much space, too much silence. We are already in the world of Samuel Beckett, a blasted landscape and traumatized people trying to decode an environment which is no longer decodable because the language which allowed us to understand it has gone with everything else.
I'm going to squeeze in one more question, if that's okay. This is from Kate from Luxembourg, and it's specifically about Crazy Jane. In the last 4 lines, I struggle with the word soul, whole, and rent. Whole and rent present a nice opposing image, but where do you think soul fits in?
Well, I think it's a sacred profane pun in the way Éimear was talking about pictorially. Nothing can be soul or whole. Soul, S-O-L-E, means solitary, integral, true to itself. But I think it's also S-O-U-L, soul, in that meaning. Or whole, W-H-O-L-E, integral and complete, but also H-O-L-E, a reference to a certain part of the human anatomy. And it's as if, again, the soul with the U and the whole with the H-O-L-E are somehow being juxtaposed to suggest that the sacred and the profane are not at all far apart. It's what St. Augustine said, inter Uranus et Feces, you know, the instruments of holiness are also the instruments of sexuality.
Again, there's 3 comments for Éimear, and I feel this interview of Anna Mccarrick has taken a lot of interest of people who've also asked what year that was.
I can't remember. You may find it on the RTE archives, you may not, I don't know, onto the Late Late Show, Gay Byrne, the Late Late Show, you may not, I don't know. I can't remember the year. Declan, can you?
It must have been, well, it was obviously before Pat Kenny took over the Late Late Show.
Oh, yeah.
So I'd say it was late 80s or maybe early 90s. But what was also shocking was that the host, Gay Byrne, frontally attacked Annie Mccarrick.
He did, yeah.
And when he mentioned the boy, the son of that coupling, you know, he said, if he's half the man his father was, he more or less implied he'd be a lot better than you. And the audience was almost lured into an applause. That was shocking because Gay Byrne had done more than most people in the media to, if you like, liberalize Irish sexuality. He was the one who first produced a condom on a talk show and showed lots of ordinary people what it looked like, even at a time when most people hadn't seen one. So for him to play that particular role, it was almost like an inversion of his image. And I think deliberately shocking for that reason too.
Yeah, and isn't it interesting, even the language used was, you know, the sacred and the profane, or the, you know, the sacred and the slut, you know?
Yeah.
Sacred man, he's fine, and the son will be fine, and she's a slut, you know?
Yes.
I think to give in his due, I think I have to say that perhaps he was as shocked as the rest of the nation was, because as far as we were concerned, priests just didn't have children. You know, like.
No, but Annie Mccarrick was an American lady. And there is a kind of national sub-theme to all this, isn't it?
Yes.
Pure Holy Ireland.
Yeah.
And
Yes.
pagan America. It used to be pagan England. Now it's suddenly pagan America.
I know, yeah. Anyway.
So many texts coming in, and we have to end soon. I just want to say this for Éimear. There's Eileen from Chicago said if you might be interested in depictions of Mary that were submitted to an exhibition called The Art of the Madonna in 1988 in Chicago, including some depictions of her as very human.
Good, excellent. I'm glad to hear it.
Well, could I just say my favorite depiction of Mary I saw in Philadelphia, and it's by H.O. Tanner, who was the first great African-American artist. And Mary looks like a totally surprised, very humane Arab teenage girl. And the angel Gabriel is just a flash of orange light, because H.O. Tanner was very interested in electricity. And it seems to me the most beautiful and the most humane of all the paintings of the Annunciation I've ever seen. And I had never heard about it till I walked into this art gallery in Philadelphia. So anyone who's near it should go to it.
You must look it up. That image is probably online. I'd love to see that.
Yeah, H.O. Tanner. It's wonderful.
Okay, I've gotten messages from my colleagues. To clarify, the Late Late Show interviewee was Annie Murphy, and
Annie Murphy, yeah.
And the year was 1993. Yeah. And the Late Late Show in RT is the equivalent of the Johnny Carson show you would have seen in the States. Like, it had been that show that everybody tuned into on a Friday evenings for our American audience. And if you want to see that interview, it is in the RTE archives, and the RTE is our national broadcaster here in Ireland. So on that note, I need to thank Éimear sincerely for joining us. I want to also congratulate her sincerely. She's the new director of the Tyrone Guthrie Center, and she will be starting her presence there in January, I believe. Is that right, Éimear?
Yes, yeah.
So a warm congratulations to you. Delighted to hear that you're going to be the director there. I also want to plug her new book, Art, Ireland and the Irish Diaspora, that has been recently, or will be recently published next month by the Irish Academic Press.
Lisa, could I just say something that's on my mind now, and it's just for the sake of correcting the record. I use the name Annie Mccarrick. Annie Mccarrick, that's a lady actually that went missing and was never found. I don't know whether you remember that story. So I didn't mean any disrespect. I just got the names confused. But it's nice to remember her too.
Thank you. It is. And I also want to thank Denise Massa from the Hesburgh Library, who helped support some of our visual resources for today. I want to, as always, thank Declan for being so generous of his time and knowledge and wisdom. He is so kind to do this with us, and I can't thank him enough. And for all of you who would like to join us and still stay in community, I want to shout out to Helen, who joined us on Friday. We did a cook along with our chef here, David Harrison, and we're more than welcome if any of you'd like to join us on Friday evening at 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Until then, I want to wish you all to be well and stay safe. And thank you once again for joining. And we'll see you next week, same time, for our last session for the Éimear Book Club. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.